The rain fell in sheets that November evening in 1944, transforming the Croatian countryside into a treacherous maze of mud and darkness. Lieutenant Jacob Weiss pressed his back against the crumbling stone wall of what had once been a farmhouse, his Wehrmacht uniform soaked through, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The partisan ambush had scattered his unit, and now he was alone, separated from his men, deep in enemy territory where every shadow could conceal death. He had been 19 when the war began, a student of literature in Vienna who had dreamed of writing novels and teaching at university. Now, at 24, he commanded men who were barely more than boys, leading them through a conflict he had long since stopped believing in. The idealism that had initially drawn him into service had eroded with each passing year, replaced by a grim determination to simply survive and keep as many of his soldiers alive as possible. The sound of voices made him freeze. They were speaking Serbo-Croatian, the language of the partisans who had been harrying German forces throughout the region for months. Jacob slowly drew his pistol, though he knew that if they found him, one weapon would mean little against the group. His best chance was to remain hidden until they passed. But fate had other plans. As he edged along the wall, seeking better cover, his boot caught on a piece of debris. The clatter of falling stones shattered the night's relative quiet, and suddenly shouts erupted from multiple directions. Jacob ran, abandoning stealth for speed, his legs pumping as bullets whined past his head. He crashed through underbrush, stumbled down an embankment, and found himself splashing through a stream he hadn't known was there. That's when he saw her. She stood in the doorway of a small cottage, illuminated by the faint glow of a lamp behind her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore the plain clothing of a local peasant woman. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jacob saw her expression shift from surprise to calculation. She could call out, alert his pursuers who were crashing through the forest not far behind him. Instead, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength and pulled him inside, pressing a finger to her lips. Her name was Maria Kovac, though Jacob wouldn't learn this until later. She was 22, a nurse who had been tending to wounded partisans in the hills around her village. Her brother had been killed by German soldiers 2 years earlier during a reprisal raid, and she had every reason to hate the man she had just pulled into her home. Yet something in that split second of eye contact had sparked a decision that defied logic and allegiance. She shoved him into a small root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, covering the entrance with a rug and a heavy table. Jacob crouched in the darkness, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it would give him away. Above him, he heard boots stomping across the floor, heard Maria's voice speaking calmly to the partisans who had burst into her cottage. She told them she had seen a German soldier running toward the main road, gestured in the opposite direction from where Jacob actually was. The soldiers thanked her and departed, their voices fading into the night. For long minutes, Jacob waited in the suffocating blackness of the cellar. Finally, the table scraped across the floor above him, and Maria's face appeared in the lamplight. She stared down at him with an expression he couldn't read, a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "Why?" he asked in German, the only word he could manage. "I don't know," she replied in halting German, learned from her father who had once worked for a merchant in Zagreb. "Maybe because I'm tired of death. Maybe because you looked young and afraid. Get up. You can't stay here." But Jacob had twisted his ankle in his flight, and when he tried to climb out of the cellar, his leg buckled beneath him. Maria caught him with a nurse's practiced hands, and her professional instincts overrode her political convictions. She helped him to a chair and began examining his injury, her touch gentle but efficient. "You're lucky it's not broken," she said, wrapping his ankle with cloth strips. "But you can't walk on it tonight. You'll have to stay until morning." Thus began the strangest night of both their lives. They sat on opposite sides of her small kitchen table, two enemies thrown together by chance and circumstance. At first they said nothing, simply watching each other with wary distrust. But as the hours crept by and the adrenaline of the chase faded, they began, tentatively, to talk. Jacob told her about Vienna, about the coffee houses where intellectuals had once debated philosophy and art. He spoke of his mother, who had wept when he left for the front, and his younger sister who still wrote him letters full of innocent observations about her studies. Maria found herself describing her village before the war, the festivals and harvests, the simple joys of a life that now seemed impossibly distant. She spoke of her brother, not with hatred, but with the aching sadness of loss. As dawn approached, they both knew the fragile bubble of their encounter would soon burst. Jacob would have to leave, to return to his war, and Maria would go back to tending the wounds of those who fought against men like him. Yet something had shifted in that night, some recognition of shared humanity that transcended the uniforms and flags that had defined them. Jacob was preparing to leave, testing his ankle gingerly, when they heard the engines. German vehicles were approaching the village, likely searching for him or conducting one of their routine sweeps for partisan activity. Maria rushed to the window and her face went pale. "They're stopping houses," she said. "Searching them. If they found Jacob here, Maria would be executed as a collaborator or spy. But if they found evidence she had been harboring partisans, she would die just as surely." Jacob saw the fear in her eyes and made a decision that surprised even himself. "Give me your partisan bandana," he said urgently. "Any identification they might use against you. I'll say I force you to help me at gunpoint. They'll take me and question me, but they won't harm you." Maria stared at him. "You would do that? For me? You saved my life last night. This is the least I can do." But before they could enact this plan, the door burst open. It wasn't German soldiers who entered, but partisans who had returned to check on Maria. They saw Jacob immediately, saw his uniform, and raised their weapons. Time seemed to slow as Jacob watched the partisan's finger tighten on the trigger, the barrel aimed directly at Maria, who stood between them. Jacob didn't think. His body simply moved, years of training overriding conscious thought. He lunged forward, shoving Maria aside just as the partisan fired. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He crashed against the table, blood spreading across his uniform. Maria screamed, but not in fear or triumph. She screamed in protest, and anger at the senselessness of it all. She threw herself at the partisan, cursing him, demanding to know why he had fired when Jacob was clearly unarmed and injured. The partisans, confused by her reaction, lowered their weapons. "He saved me," Maria said, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside Jacob. "Last night he could have turned me in, could have called his soldiers, but he didn't. And just now he took a bullet meant for me." The partisans exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the enemy they had been taught to hate, not the monster of their propaganda. This was a bleeding man who had sacrificed himself for one of their own. The partisan commander, a grizzled veteran named Tomislav, made a decision. They would take Jacob prisoner, but they would allow Maria to treat his wound. If he survived, they would decide his fate later. For now, they had witnessed something that complicated their simple narratives of good and evil. Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness over the next days as fever from his wound racked his body. Maria tended to him constantly, her medical knowledge and sheer determination keeping him alive. The partisans watched this strange tableau with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. When Jacob finally regained lucidity, he found Maria sitting beside his makeshift bed in a partisan camp deep in the forest. She smiled when his eyes opened, a tired but genuine expression. "You're stubborn," she said. "The wound was bad, but you wouldn't die." "I couldn't," Jacob replied weakly. "Not after you saved me twice." The war continued for months after that, but Jacob Weiss never returned to German lines. He remained with the partisans, initially as a prisoner but gradually as something more complex. His military knowledge proved valuable, his willingness to help undeniable. More importantly, his presence served as a living reminder that the enemy was human, that beneath the uniforms were individuals capable of conscience and sacrifice. When the war finally ended, Jacob and Maria were still together, their bond forged in that strange crucible of conflict and compassion. They married in her village church in 1946, a union that raised eyebrows and stirred old animosities but also offered a kind of hope. If two people from opposite sides of such hatred could find common ground, Perhaps reconciliation was possible for others. Years later, their grandchildren would ask them about the war, about how they met. Jacob and Maria would exchange glances, a lifetime of understanding passing between them, before beginning their story. They would speak of darkness and fear, of ideology and violence, but ultimately of the moment when one person chose mercy over vengeance, and another chose sacrifice over self-preservation. They were strangers who should have remained enemies. Instead, a bullet meant to kill became the catalyst for a love that transcended the boundaries drawn by war. In a world torn apart by hatred, they had discovered that humanity's capacity for compassion could be stronger than its capacity for cruelty, that a single act of courage could echo across generations.